Section 1.6 is talking about angle pair relationships. And I'm just going to tell you guys right now that the angle pair relationships that we look at here are really important throughout this entire course. We're going to be talking about vertical angles and linear pairs for quite some time now. So just something to be aware of, that you need to really make sure we understand this vocabulary. The first term is vertical angles. Vertical angles are two angles, and again, these are angle pairs, so of course we're always talking about two angles whose sides form two pairs of opposite rays. So if we think about that, we've got two angles whose sides form two pairs of opposite rays. Angle 1 and angle 3 would be considered vertical angles, and if I look at their sides, the sides of angle 1 form opposite rays with the sides of angle 3. So I can see the set of opposite rays here, as well as the set of opposite rays here. Notice that vertical angles are not adjacent to one another. They are across that vertex. They have a common vertex point still, but you're going to see that the two sides of those angles form straight lines with each other because they're opposite rays, but they're on those opposite corners of those sides.
A lot of times, one way to kind of help you, she even said, Ms. Hooker, we mentioned two lines. A lot of times a good way to think about vertical angles is that they're a pair of angles that are also formed by two intersecting lines. Mm-hmm. Like, it always happens that way.
Yeah. Now, a linear pair, again, we're talking about an angle pair. It's two adjacent angles. Now, notice that these two angles for vertical angles can never be adjacent. A linear pair, they are always adjacent angles, whose non-common sides are opposite rays. So we have this idea of opposite rays that we're talking about for both of these vocabulary terms. Now, a linear pair, first of all, hearing the word linear, they're making a straight line together, but they're two adjacent angles who together make a straight line because their non-common side, this would be their common side. So their non-common sides form opposite rays, and that's what makes a linear pair.
Now, before we explored in class, and we did some constructions, and we actually explored vertical angles and linear pairs in class, and you were able to kind of find out some things about them. And what did we discover about vertical angles in class?
We discovered that these two angles are always going to be congruent.
So maybe make a note of that. Maybe we need to make a note that we know in the end vertical angles will end up being congruent to each other.
And notice that here I have angle 1 and 3 are vertical angles, but we also have angles 2 and 4 are also vertical angles to each other. So angle 2 is also congruent to angle 4. Now, a linear pair, we're talking about the two of those, they're not congruent, but what do we know about those?
Well, we found out that when we added those two together, the sum of those two angles ended up being 180 degrees because it ends up being a straight line. So the sum of those ended up being 180 degrees. Now this is what we explored in class. And a lot of times it kind of looks that way too. When you look at the picture, it looks like vertical angles are congruent. Linear pairs look to be adding up to be 180. And obviously we don't want you to base off what it looks like, but it's there. It's obvious.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like there may be a postulate about some of these things later
on. Some kind of rule.
Mm-hmm.
Some other angle pairs that we will be dealing with this chapter and beyond are actually a couple types of angles that you have seen before: complementary and supplementary. Complementary angles, again, two angles, there's the pair, whose measure have a sum of 90, which basically means the two of those angles added together will add up to 90 degrees. Some things to think about: each angle is the complement of the other, and they can be adjacent or non-adjacent. So this would be adjacent scenario. Notice the two angles that are adjacent, the only way that they're complementary is they actually form a right angle.
Mm-hmm.
To be non-adjacent, well, they don't even have to touch. They could touch or not, but
they don't have that one common side.
Mm-hmm. And those still add up to 90 degrees. Supplementary, again, two angles whose measure add up to 180, which we kind of talked about some angles already about their sum of 180. Where have we seen that?
Yeah, the linear pairs. And if you look at that first example, angle 1 and angle 2 there are a linear pair. So when we're talking about supplementary angles, if they're adjacent, it will also be a linear pair.
Now, does that mean it's always going to be that case? Will we always have supplementary angles that are linear pairs?
No, because they don't have to be adjacent.
So they can be non-adjacent. So here's a case where they're supplementary because they add up to 180, but they're not a linear pair.